From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Alabama is one step closer to seeing two new members elected to the state legislature. Two special elections were held this week to fill legislative seats that were recently vacated. In House District 16, which includes Fayette County and parts of Tuscaloosa and Jefferson counties, Brian Brinyard defeated Brian Cox in a runoff to win the Republican nomination. He will face Democrat John Underwood in the special general election scheduled for January 9th. That seat was vacated by former Representative Kyle South, who left to lead the West Alabama Chamber of Commerce. And in Birmingham-based House District 55, Travis Hendricks defeated Sylvia Swain in a runoff to win the Democratic nomination. There is no Republican running, so Hendricks has effectively been elected to the legislature. That seat was vacated by former Representative Fred Plump, who resigned after being indicted on corruption charges. Another development in the state's long journey toward authorizing and regulating medical marijuana. The Medical Cannabis Commission met this week to essentially restart the licensing process. Members voted to void all licenses previously awarded after a flurry of lawsuits challenged the process. Those companies seeking to grow, transport, test, and sell medical marijuana products will now resubmit applications over the next several weeks. There will also be opportunities for applicants to give presentations to the Commission to make their case. Commission Chairman Rex Vaughn says after all the delays, they are hopeful that licenses will be awarded by the end of the year, which means products could be available by next spring.
You know, how will this kind of impact the timeline of getting medical cannabis to patients now that you guys have a new set of rules you're going to follow?
Well, we've already been impacted. You know, every time we get a month setback, it's a month down the road. But we feel like we have a timeline now that will certainly be aggressive, and it will. We see the end coming, and that was where we needed to be. So we have a process in place that will, if the calendar holds up like we hope it does, it will get us to the end of the year that we can have licenses awarded and issued, and those licensees moving forward with the industry going up and running. But that will probably put us into the spring of next year before a product will be available.
So, several of those who plan to reapply for licenses were at Thursday's commission meeting. We spoke to Antoine Mordican, CEO of Native Black Cultivation, who said the new process will give his company an opportunity to get a license and grow the business.
It's like the third fresh air under my wings. I've been in this process since the beginning, before the law even got signed, before the legislation got signed, and to learn that I constantly was not awarded a license, to be able to take the path that we're able to take now, to be able to work, to be able to get awarded a license, is very big. To be able to present to the commission, to let them know our meaning, our reasoning, our purpose for doing what it is that we're doing, to be able to make sure that we get Alabamians involved, get Alabama farmers involved, as well as get Alabama businesses involved. It creates a very unique opportunity that we can be able to create a path forward to be able to be issued a license.
A Montgomery judge has dismissed a lawsuit from Birmingham Southern College against State Treasurer Young Boozer over the denial of an emergency loan to keep the school afloat. Judge James Anderson said he was sympathetic to the college's struggles, but that the law clearly gives the authority for management of the distressed college fund to the state treasurer. At issue is the college's loan application and the inclusion of promised donations rather than actual assets as collateral. Birmingham Southern's president says they will consider an appeal, but that without court intervention, the school could face closure. The State Medicaid Utilization Board met this week to get an update on treatments and vaccines for respiratory syncytial virus, better known as RSV. You may remember Dr. Scott Harris talking about this illness last time he was on the show. It's a seasonal virus that can be especially harmful to infants and older adults. One of the most popular vaccines for the illness is facing a shortage due to high demand. But Dr. Kelly Newman, Director of Clinical Services for Alabama Medicaid, said her team has worked the last several weeks to track down doses to ensure Alabama babies and seniors have access to the drug.
We have met with KeyPro. We've, again, been in very close touch with the AAP here in Alabama, and we have a stakeholder group that we keep almost in constant contact with during this season. And the decision was made that we're just, as we receive requests for percentages because of the allocation, and we do not want to impede access to the children of the state of Alabama, we are approving those percentages requests as they come in. So that's kind of a big deal here for us in our department. I know it's not, if you are not a pediatrician in the state of Alabama and you're not one of these 4 or 7 pharmacies in the state of Alabama, it's not a big deal to you, but it is a big deal to us because RSV is a critical issue in our gestational babies. So we have I believe, very quickly addressed that.
Turning now to Washington, where this week the House of Representatives finally elected a speaker. Mike Johnson of Louisiana was elected with all House Republicans voting in favor after 3 weeks of infighting since former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was ousted. Addressing the chamber after taking the gavel, Speaker Johnson said the House had work to do in restoring the public's trust to the people's House.
To my colleagues, I want to thank you all for the trust that you have instilled in me to lead us in this historic and unprecedented moment that we're in. The challenge before us is great, but the time for action is now, and I will not let you down. I think all the American people at one time had great pride in this institution, but right now, that's in jeopardy. And we have a challenge before us right now to rebuild and restore that trust. This is a beautiful country. It's the beauty of America that allows a firefighter's kid like me to come here and serve in this sacred chamber where great men and women have served before all of us and strive together to build and then preserve what Lincoln did refer to as the last best hope of man on earth. We stand at a very dangerous time. I'm stating the obvious. We all know that. The world is in turmoil. But a strong America is good for the entire world.
Alabama Congressman Gary Palmer briefly threw his name in the hat to be considered for Speaker before withdrawing and endorsing Johnson. I'll speak with Mr. Palmer about these last 3 weeks in Congress later in the show. U.S. Senator Katie Britt returned from Israel this week after visiting with some of that nation's top political and military leaders. She was also shown footage of some of the Hamas attacks, which she described as, quote, pure evil.
We must stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel as they eradicate Hamas terrorists. These terrorists don't care. They don't care how many men they kill, how many women they rape, how many children they kidnap. If you haven't watched the video of the children, the toddlers, the babies being held by terrorists, them using them as human shields, go watch it. If you haven't listened to the reporters tell about walking in to the place where these atrocities happened, them giving their recount of what they saw, what it felt like, go watch it. We cannot turn a blind eye to evil. We must stand firm with Israel.
October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. With so much of what we do every day connected to the internet, it's easy to take our security for granted. Capitol Journal's Randy Scott reports on how officials are working to help teach people about how to protect themselves online.
Many people look at the month of October as a scary time due to Halloween, but there are some things experts say people really need to be worried about, things like cybersecurity protection. This is why October is designated as Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Cybersecurity is very important. It touches pretty much everything you do on a daily basis. From browsing the web, most people use their phones for banking. So the more you're aware of how cybersecurity works and affect your life, I think the easier it is for you to protect yourself.
Tony Porterfield is the Chief Technology Officer for the City of Montgomery. It's his job to help keep Montgomery safe from cyber threats, and he has a collection of tools to do his job.
It allows you to keep a 24-hour monitor on your network. We have a concierge service that notifies us of any intrusions or possible intrusions and let us know if there's any false positives that looks like an intrusion, but it's not.
There are a few days left in October, designated as Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Experts say the lessons taught during this time period should be used by citizens to protect their homes, businesses, even state governments. But those lessons, experts warn, should not be focused on just during October, but year-round.
Old school security is not sufficient anymore. The bad guys are going after your personal identity and your business identity. You have to have systems in place to monitor for that. You have to have systems in place to react when you do find something.
Bradshaw is the CEO of Shaw Technology, an IT business helping to fight problems and crime in cyberspace. He has many suggestions for citizens, companies, and other entities to stay safe.
Complex passwords. Don't use the same password anywhere. You really need to practice separation between personal and business passwords. You really need to have MFA, so multi-factor authentication.
In downtown Montgomery, Tony Porterfield says being vigilant is important.
Most people, they sometimes take it for granted because it's so accessible. But I think that, if you have it happen to you, it's easier for you to learn how to keep it from happening again. So I think that the more knowledgeable the community is about cybersecurity, the easier it is for them, businesses, to protect themselves.
For Capital Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
Coming up next on the show, I'll speak with Congressman Gary Palmer about the House Speaker saga, plus his future political plans. Later, I'll sit down with U.S. Attorney Prim Escalona to talk about her role in bringing the Natalee Holloway case to a resolution, plus other issues her office is tackling. And House Minority Leader Anthony Daniels joins us later in the show to discuss his child care tax credit proposal and a possible run for Congress. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Joining me next from Washington is Alabama Congressman Gary Palmer of the 6th District. Congressman, thanks for coming on Capital Journal.
Thanks for having me on, Todd.
Well, it has been a wild 3 weeks up there in Washington in the House. You finally have a speaker now in Mike Johnson. That's got to be a sense of relief that the process is finally over.
Well, it's a sense of relief, but it's also, I'm really excited about Speaker Johnson. Mike and I knew each other before we were ever elected to Congress. And during my time working in the pro-family movement with what was the Alabama Policy Institute and Mike's work with the Alliance Defending Freedom, we had a very high regard for each other even before we got elected to Congress. He came in a term after me, and interestingly, his office was like 3 doors down from mine. So we've had a very good working relationship, both before and after we were in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Well, you put your own name forward for Speaker after Jim Jordan came up short. There was a kind of a long list of folks being considered. Obviously, you eventually bowed out and supported Mike Johnson. But tell me, what led you to put your name forward for Speaker in the first place?
Well, Mike, I thought was was a very high quality candidate. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier when we were talking was about how convoluted things had gotten in our conference meetings leading up to choosing a speaker. And it got to the point where members weren't listening to each other. They weren't talking about solutions and how we get to the right place on some of these key issues, particularly on appropriations. And I thought about it, and struggled with it all weekend, right up till literally 7 minutes before the deadline. And I thought somebody's got to run for the speakership in order to address these issues. And so literally with 7 minutes before the deadline, I sent Elise Stefanik a text saying that I would get in. And what I wanted to talk about in particular was how we address the appropriations issue. We, every year, and you were up here, and so you've experienced this yourself, we get right up to that September 30th deadline, we create these cliffs for ourselves, and then we start passing short-term continuing resolutions that expire right before Thanksgiving or right before Christmas when everybody wants to go home. And then we get hammered with a bunch of omnibus bills. So what I proposed during the candidate forum was that we dispense with the Congressional Budget Act requirement of, or at least the tradition of waiting on the president to submit a budget. Biden was 100 days late, and we don't pay any attention to the president's budget. So do away with that. Dispense with waiting till May 15th to take up appropriations bills on the floor. If a subcommittee is ready to bring them up, we bring them up when they're ready. But the the Budget Control Act requires that all appropriations bills be passed by June 30th, but there's no enforcement. Mm-hmm. So what I do is say if they're not passed by June 30th, no other legislation can be considered on the floor until all 12 appropriations bills are passed. So we don't create these cliffs for ourselves. Then the other thing is require the Senate to get those bills back to us in 30 days. And if they don't, no Senate-originated legislation will be considered until they do. And if we don't get our appropriations bills done by September 30th, we'll have a self-executing continuing resolution that cuts spending, discretionary spending, by 1%, with exceptions for defense and military construction and veterans, through April 15th. So you don't have any more of these short-term continuing resolutions that wind up resulting in omnibus bills.
Well, take us inside these conference meetings, because I mean, it's there in the Capitol, that big room in the basement. All the Republicans gather, your entire conference, and that's where these meetings have been taking place. I guess some in Longworth as well. But you know, these factions in the party amongst the conference. You've got sort of the more MAGA Freedom Caucus faction. You've got the kind of traditional Republican faction. How, inside those meetings, those arguments, how are those dividing lines as stark as they appear to us from the outside?
I think there was a general agreement on that we needed to change the process, that we needed to address the issues. But one of the things that kept messing us up was a lot of this was personal. And so it felt like we were just going through a washing out. And some of it, I think, was patently unfair, but you can't do anything about that. I think we had to get down to a candidate like Mike Johnson, who has unquestioned conservative credentials, who's a terrific guy. I mean, very likable, but also someone who is an excellent communicator. If you heard his speech, his acceptance speech, it was outstanding. And Mike is a very thoughtful guy. He's a brilliant constitutional lawyer. And I think we had to go through that process to get there. And the good thing about having so many people put their name forward for the speakership, it gave members a chance to direct questions to those of us who sat before them. And I tell people this all the time, I learn a whole lot more listening than I do talking. And I think it really gave us some insights into where we need to go and how we need to conduct our business. Mm.
Well, it seems to me that the best way for this Republican majority to get wins to govern is to grow the majority, to have a bigger majority, because it's easier to govern that way, right? But that means winning elections. And are you concerned that this episode and all the just the chaotic nature of it the last 3 weeks will damage the Republican brand, in the eyes of voters going into 2024?
I think there's a couple of things that you can take into account here. One is I'm really impressed with how energized the conservative base is over the election of Mike Johnson. And that's across the board, the pro-family crowd, the conservative, even on the libertarian side. I think there's a lot of excitement for Johnson as Speaker. The other thing, though, is you have to deliver. I've got a number of bills that I think we can get to the floor. We're going to finish the appropriations process and send them over to the Senate. We probably have to pass a continuing resolution. The question is, how long will it go? If it can go through the end of January, then the Massey, or through April 15th, then the Massey continuing resolution will go into effect. But we have to deliver, and I think we're going to. I just got an amendment passed that strikes down a Department of Energy regulation that will make people's air conditioning a whole lot more expensive. We've got to get out there and address the issues that people are facing. They're having difficulty buying groceries, paying for the gas for their vehicles. They're going to have difficulty if we have a really cold winter paying to keep their homes heated. And those are the things that I think will make a difference in the next election.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about your own political future. After redistricting, there's all these districts are different. Yours is different. There's been speculation that you might not run for re-election. Can I ask you, do you plan on running for another term?
Yeah, I've already said that I felt like I needed to run again, and I've had a number of people coming to me and saying, having lost Sessions and Shelby in the Senate, having lost Martha Roby, who was an appropriator, and Bradley Byrne, who was on the Rules Committee, that the power has shifted from the Senate, as far as Alabama is concerned, to the House, where you've got Mike Rogers chairing Armed Services, you've got Robert Adderholt chairing one of the subcommittees on appropriations, and I'm in leadership. I chair the Policy Committee, and I'm also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And even though I've only been there, 8 years, 9 months, and 23 days, I'm now the third most senior Republican in our delegation. So I felt, in terms of what's best for the 6th District, what's best for the state of Alabama, that I needed to stay. And I'm really excited about the quality of people that we have in our delegation. Tuberville has done really well. Katie Britt's going to be a rock star. But we need to let the newcomers, so to speak, get established, get the committees that they need to be on. We've already got Jerry Carl. He's in his first term as an appropriator. And I think I don't plan to be there drooling in my oatmeal, contrary to what some people might think. That's not my plan. But I do think you have to stay long enough to complete the mission, and I don't think the mission's complete yet.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for taking time out of your day up there on Capitol Hill to join us. And I guess congratulations on having the episode finally over. But we'll be following the actual legislation, getting back to work, including on the appropriations. But thanks again, Congressman.
Great to see you, Todd, and thanks for having me on.
We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Last week, the family of Natalee Holloway finally got the answers they've sought about her disappearance for 18 years when Joran Vandersloot was compelled to confess as a part of a guilty plea agreement to the charge of extortion. His statement detailed his brutal killing of the Mountain Brook teen in Aruba in 2005. Vandersloot's extradition and conviction were made possible by the work of American and Peruvian prosecutors, most notably Prim Escalona, U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. She was kind enough to sit down with Capitol Journal to talk about the Holloway case and other issues her office is working on. Here's our interview. Prim, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Yeah, glad to be here.
The Natalee Holloway case doesn't get much bigger, a higher profile than that. I think if you asked most Alabamians or really anybody nationwide that followed this case, most would bet that the family never would have gotten a final resolution. It just seemed impossible after 18 years. Yet now they do. And you played a key role in bringing the suspect back to this country to stand in court. Talk about that. Where did your involvement in this case begin?
So I think, like most people, especially I grew up in Alabama, and I think for most people who are from Alabama, everyone remembers where they were when they heard about Natalee Holloway and her disappearance. And it really was something that I followed, and I think most Alabamians followed over the years that, after her disappearance, and everything that her family has done and everything the media has done to keep her kind of and justice for her family in the forefront. And so I certainly was aware of all of that. Now, I will admit that when I came to this position, I was not aware that there was the indictment in 2010. And so when we learned about that, and we learned about the efforts that had been made previously to bring Joran van der Sloot back to the country, things that had been going on since 2012, 2014, that had not been successful to try to extradite him back, we talked to the FBI and others and thought, well, let's try one more time. And so new information had kind of developed. There was more of a pressing need. The media focus was still on that case and the importance of it. And so it gave us the opportunity to go back to Peru. And the Peruvian government had changed, and so their willingness to extradite him at that time had changed. And so we were able to do that, and it was wonderful to be able to do that for the Holloway family and for Natalee.
Well, I know that his conviction is not actually for the murder that he has confessed to. That was part of the arrangement, right? Which was just, I know, a big deal for the family. So walk me through the particulars of what, where, and when, like how long will he actually serve and where will he serve?
Right. So yes, we do not have jurisdiction over the murder. So he was not tried for that. He was tried for the separate charges of the extortion and the wire fraud related to his extortion of Beth Holloway about where Natalee's remains were. And so he typically for those charges might expect maybe 3 to 5 years, but he agreed, and we agreed to that 20-year sentence. The judge ran that 20-year sentence concurrent with his sentence in Peru. So he'll serve his time in Peru, and that was part of the treaty to begin with. It was always going to be that he would go back to Peru and serve his time in Peru before he would come and serve time in the United States. But the judge here ran that sentence concurrent with his Peruvian sentence. So he will serve his time, his 20 years, in Peru in custody. Now, if his Peruvian sentence in custody ends before the 20 years, he will have to come back to the United States and serve the remainder here, if for some reason. Now, he's set to serve 20 additional years in Peru under his charges there. But if for some reason that sentence were to be shortened and his sentence in custody ended, he would then have to come back.
Like we said, this is a high-profile case, and it got a lot of attention. I'm sure there are many other cases that don't get nearly the attention that this one does. But given that its nature of being high-profile, how important is it for people to see it, to see justice served, to maybe have a little bit more faith in the justice system and that it works?
I think that's so true. We do hundreds of sentencings every year. We prosecute, hundreds and hundreds of defendants for a variety of crimes each year. And so a lot of them don't get the attention that they maybe rightfully deserve. And a lot of times what we do see is we see, the crime occur, so there's some press there sometimes, and then we see maybe at the indictment, and then it's very quiet until sentencing or until a plea or a trial. And so it's a nice reminder that even when we don't hear about things happening, the work is being done. And the Department of Justice so often works behind the scenes where they don't do it in the press. They can't for a variety of reasons, whether it's protection of the case, protection of victims, law enforcement concerns. But the public should know that just because you don't see something happening doesn't mean the work's not getting done. And I think that's a great example here. There were things that were being done starting in 2010 that bore fruit in 2023. And it took a long time, and it took a lot of people at every level of the government. At our office, at the Department of Justice, at the State Department, overseas, there were so many people engaged. The FBI, tenacious about it. Even outside entities that kept the focus on Natalee and on the Holloway family. And so all of that kind of works together over time, and seeds that are planted in 2010 and 2012 and 2014 finally bore that fruit in 2023. And it was so gratifying to be even a small part of that. And so I think that's just a reminder to folks that just because you don't see the work being done does not mean that justice is not coming.
Switching gears, we cover the legislature a lot, and your office has an open case involving corruption charges on state lawmakers, well, one former, one current, and staff. Like you just said, I realize you probably can't comment on the specifics of individual cases and things like that, but talk about the importance, why it's important to have these types of investigations from the federal level into public officials.
I think one thing that's really important is for us to remember that our country is built on the rule of law. And the idea there is that everyone is subject to the law, and no one is above the law or beyond the law. And so our office, when we look at public corruption cases, we think about that, because just as the people who work in, whether they work in the legislature or the jail or a federal corrections facility, we want to make sure that the people that communities have put their trust in maintain that trust and follow the law. So anytime that we see a situation where someone has violated the law, violated their ethical duties, violated the trust that the community has put in them, that's something that we want to address, because we want folks to know in this district that they're represented by people that are at the highest levels, operating at the highest levels of ethics and within the bounds of the law. But I have to say, it's not just a federal prosecution. We do so much with our state and local partners, because it's so important to work with the state AG's office and our local DAs, because we see our work as supporting their work in so many ways. And sometimes there are times where it makes more sense for prosecutions to happen on the state level, and sometimes it makes more sense for them to happen on the federal level. We've got a great team here, and public corruption and ferreting that out is vitally important to our office, and it's something that we have some attorneys who are fantastic in that realm, but it all is driven by a desire to make our institutions as secure and as worthy of trust as possible.
Well, speaking of working with state and local law enforcement, you have focused on two heinous crimes during your time as U.S. Attorney: drug trafficking and sex trafficking, something that is really coming into focus nationwide and in Alabama. But talk about the difference it makes to bring the Justice Department, the resources of the Justice Department, the federal government, to bear when it comes to those crimes in particular. Because a lot of times you're talking about across state lines and things like that, and state and local law enforcement sometimes have limited resources.
So I think those are two areas that, like you pointed out, very similarly cross not only state lines, but often international lines, especially when you're talking about sex trafficking and you have the internet, the explosion of the internet. And it could be predators who are in one state, finding victims in a completely different state. And sometimes when you have that, same with drug trafficking, you have a situation where criminals can be smart and they can try to elude local authorities. And so when the federal government gets involved, it's a way to kind of cross those lines. It's bringing people together and saying, oh, I have a connection in Milwaukee, right? And a local connection there. And so that kind of network that we have both on the trafficking side that the department facilitates, on the sex trafficking side, and also on the drug trafficking side. Systems in place that connect prosecutors, federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, so everyone is talking to each other and working towards that common goal. The other thing that the department brings to bear in both of those situations is a lot of victim services. And, local law enforcement is wonderful, but they are oftentimes very financially strapped. And so a lot of times they just don't have the resources to do that victim services work, especially in the sex trafficking that takes long-term victim services. And the federal government is very fortunate in that we have folks on staff that do victim services as their entire job. So we bring that aspect as well. So we can do the prosecution, we can follow it through the entire prosecution, but we can also help the victims after trial and kind of regain their footing. It's also in both of those areas, we do a lot with grants, with bringing federal dollars into our district that get used to combat sex trafficking, child pornography and child exploitation, and also drug trafficking. So, for instance, I think in the last maybe 5 years, about $14 million in federal DOJ grants have come into the Northern District to deal with the drug epidemic and the fentanyl crisis. We also have seen about $10 million coming in to the National Child Advocacy Center in Huntsville that helps child advocacy centers across the country deal with child exploitation and sex trafficking. So we can bring not only resources in terms of people and prosecutions, but also in terms of grant dollars.
Well, I know that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and you have this initiative, Operation Safe Families. It's been going for a couple of years now. Talk about the impact that it's had.
So that was one of the first things that I did when I came into this office, because I really felt like anecdotally, I believed that domestic violence led to community violence. And that has been borne out through research that the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office has done. So the DA's office looked at all of their statistics, and they realized that about 70% of their homicide offenders, just in general, were committed domestic violence, had a history of domestic violence. And so what we know now, and from data, which we knew anecdotally, is that domestic violence leads to community violence. So in the Northern District, we want our communities to be safe.
That probably includes gun violence. Right?
Absolutely, it includes gun violence. In fact, if a gun is involved in a domestic violence incident, it's 500 times more likely that that will result in a homicide.
Wow.
And so, you know, it feels right anecdotally that if you're willing to harm the people that you love the most, then it's not a very far step to harm people out in the community. And so we're seeing, as we see violent crime that has increased over the past few years, we now know that domestic violence is a precursor to a lot of violent crime. So if we can intercede early in the domestic violence cycle, then we can drive down community-based violent crime, which is always a goal of our office.
Well, it strikes me you are a rarity as a prosecutor. You have served both in a Republican administration and now in a Democratic administration. That's kind of rare for U.S. attorneys. How did you manage that?
Well, it's been a great honor. This is a wonderful job, and it has been a delight to be here. I was fortunate enough to come in kind of at the tail end of the last administration and was court appointed and have remained on during this administration. And you know, people so often focus on differences. What I can tell you is this job is very similar from administration to administration in a lot of ways and in the ways that matter. The focus remains on keeping communities safe, decreasing violent crime, protecting civil rights, ferreting out public corruption. And those core values have been this office's core values for years across many administrations, and it is just an honor to get to continue that legacy. I
guess that's the way it should be. We shouldn't change the values and core values of the office just because of different parties in the White House.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of change on the margins, and the emphasis changes, and the way that things, you know, at the edges change a little, but the core work that prosecutors do across this country remains steady, regardless of, you know, kind of what the political atmosphere is.
Well, you also worked at Main Justice, right? The building right there, the nerve center kind of the whole Justice Department. So I'm curious if that experience, because you know, walking those halls, knowing in those meetings, sort of understanding the nuances of how Maine justice works, makes you a better prosecutor with that knowledge?
Well,
here in the district, right, and the local.
I'll have to tell a quick story if it's okay.
Sure.
So when I was, I'm coming from a very small town, Wetumpka, near Montgomery, and when I was growing up, it was even smaller than it is today. It was way before HGTV came to town.
Speaking from the Prattville section,
yes.
we're aware.
And so I grew up, you know, in a very small town, and a lot of my friends either went to local colleges or chose to go into other professions, and so I went to Birmingham Southern College. And I can remember being a freshman and walking across the quad and thinking, there is nothing better. This is the apex of being cool. Is I'm in college, I'm on a campus, I'm getting to be in college classes. This is amazing. And the second time that I had that feeling was walking through the doors of Maine Justice and getting to work in those halls and being able to see where attorneys general for years have been, and to be in those offices and to see the the inside of the AG's office, and get to work with folks who have devoted their entire lives to justice and the pursuit of justice. And those are some hallowed halls. And I know there are, a lot of knocks on the Department of Justice these days, which I think are unwarranted in a lot of ways, because the vast majority of the people who work in that building are doing excellent work. They're working hard, and they're working towards justice, and I think that is wonderful. And it was a privilege for me to get to work there. And it is something, I think, that perspective of all of the work that goes, all of the components and all of the work that goes into the Justice Department, and being able to bring that knowledge back to the district, knowing about that, ATF has a NIBIN program, and getting to see that in other places, and get to come here and talk to folks here about, well, let me tell you what they're doing in Wichita. Being able to know how grants move through the system, to be able to help our local partners when they're talking about what grants they should apply for or how to do it, is incredibly valuable. Just knowing kind of the structure. We laugh and say, the Department of Justice loves an acronym. So if you can know the acronyms, then you're a step ahead. And so knowing the acronyms, knowing kind of who does what and what levers to pull, I think is incredibly beneficial. And also just realizing kind of the magnitude of what the department does and the resources it brings to bear across the country is helpful when you come into an office, because you've kind of seen the big picture, which is lovely.
United States Attorney Prim Escalona, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Joining me next is State Representative Anthony Daniels, Minority Leader for the Alabama House of Representatives. Mr. Leader, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Todd. It's always good to be here with you.
We talk a lot on the show about the workforce shortage, right? The workforce participation rate that's suffered in Alabama. The governor's now had a big focus on it. You had this interesting op-ed in Alabama Daily News recently about child care specifically, and how the lack of access to child care really serves as a barrier for folks to get back into the workforce. You've got some legislative proposals. Talk about the issue and what you want to, how you want to attack it.
Well, Todd, I'll tell you, we're dealing within our own private business, but you hear from business owners across the state of Alabama that's trying to figure out what is it that we could do to try to get increase the workforce participation rate. And so what we've found is, since COVID, there's a lot of women out that are taking care of their children, and so oftentimes there's not access is an issue, and cost. And so what we want to do is develop a piece of legislation to address the workforce, the shortages in the workforce, while at the same time providing an opportunity and an option for families to be able to have their children in front of a curriculum. And so it takes care of education as well as workforce, but it also helps that working family and allow them to be able to operate freely. So what this legislation will do, certainly Senator Gudger introduced it in the Senate last year. I introduced it in the House, and we'll be reintroducing it in this legislative session, that will give businesses an opportunity and providers an opportunity to build child care facilities, but offer incentives to those employees. If you're a business, you can offer an incentive to your employees to be able to have their children go to that child care facility, either give it to the employee in their check, or you can pay directly to the provider to be able to offer a slot for that employee. For the providers themselves, it gives them an opportunity to expand their business model, to be able to continue to deliver high quality content and curriculum to our children, which for me, on the education standpoint, does exactly what we want. You know, we know that every dollar invested in early childhood saves you $7 in corrections, and this addresses that issue while at the same time increasing the workforce participation rate for the state of Alabama.
So it's not some new government program. It's really like incentivizing the private sector to offer more options to parents. And you're so right, because it's in terms of the barrier, because I know so many moms that it's cost, it's finding it, and sometimes it's the choice between caring for your child or taking a job, right? And that, I guess that really shouldn't be a choice.
Absolutely, and for us, you know, it really helps that family member, help that entire family, because at the end of the day, when what you're making on the job site is basically you're breaking even to pay for childcare.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
It becomes a wash,
right?
And so, but families want to have their children in a childcare facility that's delivering high quality content. Because we know that what that does for that child when they do start grade school, and so we know what these investments will do, and so every family member wants that option for their children. But right now, the access is not there in the affordability, and if there is a huge demand, that drives up the cost of that healthcare option for that child care for that child, which that family have to make a decision on whether I go to work or whether I stay home. Which one is more affordable for my family?
Yeah. Well, eager to see that. You know, session will be here before you know it, and I think that's going to be an interesting topic to follow. Well, last session you had a very high-profile bill, basically an overtime income tax cut, right? If you work overtime, you know, taking away state income tax from that. I believe it goes into effect in January in the new year. What have you heard in terms of feedback from the Department of Revenue and from employers about the impact this is going to have?
Well, I will tell you this. First of all, my hat goes off to Vernon Burnett. He's been a great partner. He's been out there offering sessions to businesses to help them understand the implementation phase. He's done this since we left the legislative session, and so you can't have a better partner than the Department of Revenue in this instance. And so I certainly appreciate him and applaud him. All the businesses within the state of Alabama, whether it's BCA or Manufacturing Alabama, right now what they've been doing is offering sessions to their members and educating their members on the implementation. But what I hear from a lot of their members and businesses across the state of Alabama, they're excited about it. You know, I was just talking to industry down in the Mobile area where they talked about the number of employees that's going over to work at Ingle across the Mississippi, and they feel that this particular piece of legislation, it's basically a 5% pay raise on overtime. And so what this piece of legislation will do is it will put more money in the pockets of those individuals that are Alabamians or Mobilians that are working over in Ingle, and hopefully, and they're hopeful that they'll come back to work in the Mobile area at the industries that are with them in the Mobile area. And a lot of those industries offer overtime options. And so to be able to get a 5% pay raise without the actual employer having to give it to you is a win-win situation for the community, for the employer, and the employee.
So it makes Alabama more competitive, I guess.
Absolutely, and commerce, I think, this will be a benefit for them to be able to use when they're talking to companies. We're the only first state to ever implement this piece of legislation. I do hear that Wisconsin has introduced a piece of legislation. There's another state that have introduced a piece of legislation. I've received calls inquiring about this piece of legislation from across the country. But I know that for us, in Alabama, we hope that this will further increase the participation rate, but also get people that's not working to want to come back to work, but those that are working, it gives them a little extra money to be able to provide for their families.
Lord knows that's needed these days, more money in this economy. Switching gears to healthcare, there have been a couple of stories recently kind of concerning about maternity care wards closing. Obviously, we've got the hospital closure situation, nursing shortage. There was one report that said Alabama had the second worst healthcare system in the country. So it all kind of, in each of these stories, the question of Medicaid expansion keeps coming up. I realize that most Republicans are against that and they're in control, but are there other ways that you can see Alabama trying to fill that coverage gap and improve our healthcare system?
Here's where I am. We can't afford not to do it. You know, when you saw the hospital, the maternal care unit in the hospital in Monroe County, that should be concerning to everyone in that particular region. When you see the hospital, that part of the hospital, maternal care, closing in other areas, you have to be concerned. We've been talking about this for some time. That's why Medicaid expansion is important. I think that one of the misunderstanding about Medicaid expansion is that who it helps. It helps those persons that are in the gap. You know, it may be a person that's working part-time jobs for a small business that small business doesn't offer health care to them. It gives them an opportunity to have health care. Because at the end of the day, we got to focus on the front end and the preventative side of it. And for places like Monroe County, where those families, where those mothers, where those families are going to be able to get the maternal care that they need. And so they got to go travel to Mobile. They have to travel to Montgomery and other places that are larger markets. And so, and then some of those the hospitals that are in these other larger markets are suffering as well. And so Medicaid expansion is something that we can't afford not to do. We have to close the healthcare gap in Alabama, and we have to give families an opportunity to be able to get preventative care as well as care, postpartum care as well. You know, think about, you know, my wife and I, we have 2 children at home. I was with my wife every step of the way and understood the difficulties and the challenges that she had. You know, fortunately, we had an OBGYN in the Huntsville area that can see my wife. But there are many families and many counties across the state of Alabama that don't have those options. And so we have to focus on making certain that families have the appropriate care. But Medicaid expansion is an economic booster as well. It expands the number of jobs in the state of Alabama, increases our tax base. And so there's so many wonderful things and positives about it. And we just have to put the politics to the side and address these issues head on.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you've mentioned Mobile, you've mentioned Monroe County. It strikes me that those are 2 places in the newly constituted 2nd Congressional District. I mean, I'm joking, but you have been mentioned as a potential candidate in the 2nd District. It's changed a lot, obviously, but you are a native of the 2nd District, Bullitt County in particular. So how realistic are these rumors? Are you considering the race, and what's your decision making, knowing that November 10th, I guess, is the deadline?
At the end of the day, I am entertaining it. I've had people from Bullitt County and other counties, surrounding counties, that I frequent as minority leader. Mm-hmm. When you're a minority leader, you're the minority leader for the entire state of Alabama. And so it's not, you may represent a district in your personal capacity, but as the leader, you're representing the entire state. You know, whether it's helping members with projects within their district, I've been there. And so I think that, you know, you have to look at it. It is an opportunity. But, you know, at the end of the day, what you got to look at is how effective can you be in that role. And when Alabama is looking at sending someone to Congress, they're going to have to look at those dynamics. How effective can this person be? How effective have they been in the role that they're currently in? Mm-hmm. And to determine whether or not, you know, at the end of the day, it's not just filling a seat. It's filling a void. It's looking at whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge in Washington. You need someone that's going to have the ability to get things done. And at the end of the day, people, that's what they're saying to me. You know, you've gotten things done in a supermajority, Republican supermajority, and you've been able to do it without compromising the principles of being a Democrat. And I said to them, at the end of the day, it's about Alabama, it's about the district, it's about our state and growth and opportunity. And so, I am entertaining it, I'm strongly considering it, and there are other candidates out there that I think will be great candidates. From a legislative standpoint, legislative experience does help prepare you for another layer or legislative experience. So day one, you're not looking, you're not trying to figure out the job. And so I think that there will be some wonderful people running for this office that have great credentials and great opportunity. And so I think that it'll likely be a crowded field. If I decide to get in, I'll get in and I'll work extremely hard. But at the end of the day, the legislative experience is a plus for anyone considering running for the 2nd Congressional District.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really going to be fascinating to see this race develop. We're out of time, but Mr. Leader, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you. Always good.
We'll be right back.
Ralph Shug Jordan coached the Auburn Tigers for 24 seasons from 1951 through 1975. With 176 wins, Coach Jordan led his alma mater to more wins than any other head football coach in Auburn's rich football history. He's a member of the College Football Hall of Fame. The 1950s were probably his best decade, with the Tigers winning the national championship in 1957. I'm Thomas Gosson, wide receiver on Coach Jordan's 1972 football team, nicknamed the Amazings. A major underdog entering the season, we finished with a 10-1 record, number 5 in the country, including the infamous Punt Bama Punt Iron Bowl victory. Coach always said that his 1972 team was one of his favorites. Coach Jordan remains one of the most highly respected personalities in the history of Auburn University, not only because of his success as a head football coach, but also because of his tireless devotion to the Auburn community.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week at the same time with more Capitol Journal right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.